In the summer of 1874, 29 buffalo hunters, traders, and one woman were pinned inside a crumbling trading post called Adobe Walls in the Texas Panhandle. Outside, somewhere between 700 and 1,000 Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne warriors had them surrounded. The attack had come before dawn. By midday, the hunters had beaten back 3 charges and dragged their dead inside. The adobe walls were cracked. The water supply was running low. And when the defenders looked out across the flat brown earth of the Panhandle, they could see a group of mounted warriors assembling on a distant ridge, watching. The ridge was measured afterward at 874 yards away, nearly half a mile. Billy Dixon was 23 years old. He was a professional buffalo hunter, not a soldier, not a legendary gunfighter. He picked up his heavy Sharps rifle, rested the long octagonal barrel on the crumbling adobe wall, squinted at the distant riders through the summer heat, adjusted his rear sight for the range, and squeezed the trigger. One of the riders on that distant ridge fell from his horse. The warriors broke. They did not charge again that day. The siege that had already cost 2 men their lives was effectively over, ended by a single rifle shot fired across a distance that most men of that era believed was simply beyond the reach of any firearm. But what made that shot possible was not Billy Dixon's courage alone and not entirely his skill. It was the rifle in his hands, a weapon so powerful and so accurate at distances that seemed impossible to the men of that era that it changed the entire psychology of violence on the American frontier. It made men afraid to stand in open ground. It made cavalry commanders rethink their tactics. It created a specific kind of terror unlike anything a revolver or a repeating rifle could produce, because it was the terror of the invisible, the unseen threat from a distance so great that your enemy might be gone before you even understood you were under fire. This is the story of the Sharps rifle, why it was feared, who carried it, what it could actually do, and why cowboys, warriors, and soldiers across the American West learned to scan the far hills for a man they might never see. The American West in the 1860s and 1870s was a place where the tools of warfare had not yet caught up with the geography. A soldier carrying a Springfield musket or even an early breech-loading carbine had an effective range of perhaps 200 yards on a good day against a stationary target by a trained shooter under decent conditions. In real combat, against moving targets in wind and dust and the confusion of a firefight, 200 yards was generous. Most fights happened inside 100 yards. Many happened inside 50. This shaped everything about how violence worked on the frontier. You got close, or you did not fight. Cavalry charged. Infantry formed lines and advanced toward the enemy. Gunfighters faced each other in streets and across saloon floors. The gun, for all its fearsome reputation, was a tool that required proximity to be decisive. And on the Great Plains, and where the landscape offered almost no cover and visibility stretched for miles in every direction, proximity was the most dangerous thing a man could ask for. The Comanche understood this better than almost anyone. They had perfected mounted combat over generations, and a Comanche warrior at full gallop could fire multiple arrows in the time it took a soldier to reload a single-shot rifle. The man on foot was always reactive, always forced to let the fight come to him, spending his one shot, and then waiting through those helpless seconds of vulnerability while he reloaded. That calculus of frontier violence had been stable for decades. Then a rifle came along that changed the underlying mathematics of the fight, that extended the killing zone from 200 yards to 500 to 600, to a distance so far that the sound of the shot arrived after the bullet had already done its work. That rifle was the Sharps. And the men who learned to use it were never afraid of open ground again, because open ground was where they worked best. Christian Sharps was a gunsmith from New Jersey, and in 1848 he patented a design that would take 20 more years to fully realize its potential on the frontier. The falling block breech mechanism was the essential innovation. Where earlier single-shot rifles used complicated paper cartridges and a slow charging process that left a shooter defenseless for 15 to 30 seconds between shots, the Sharps used a vertical sliding block that dropped down to expose the chamber when the trigger guard was levered forward. You slipped in a cartridge, closed the block, cocked the hammer, and fired. With practice, you could load and fire again in under 10 seconds. Against a Springfield musket that required 12 to 15 steps and twice that time to reload, 10 seconds was a significant tactical advantage. But the loading speed was not the most important thing the Sharps offered. The most important thing was what happened when you paired that mechanism with a long, heavy, octagonal barrel, precision rifling cut deep into the steel, and a cartridge powerful enough to drive a heavy lead bullet at velocities that no previous sporting or military arm had achieved in a practical package. The result was a rifle that, in the hands of a skilled shooter using the adjustable vernier rear sight, could consistently place bullets on targets at ranges that seemed to border on the miraculous to men used to the limitations of muskets and carbines. The early Sharps saw service in the Civil War, and what happened there planted the seed of fear that would grow on the frontier. Union sharpshooters under commanders like Hiram Berdan organized entire regiments specifically selected for their marksmanship and equipped them with Sharps rifles, then positioned them forward of the main lines with orders to pick off Confederate officers, artillery crews, and observers. The effect was immediate and lasting. Officers who had once ridden on horseback in plain view of the front lines because they needed to be seen by their men stopped doing that. A man on horseback silhouetted against the sky, wearing a uniform that set him apart from enlisted men, was a target at 400 yards. That was something no military doctrine had fully accounted for before. Confederate officers began to dress like their enlisted men. They began to give orders on foot behind earthworks. They began to look at distant ridgelines with a new calculation, not asking whether there was an enemy over there, but asking whether there was an enemy with a Sharps over there. The veterans who came west after the war brought that lesson with them. The rifle that truly defined the Sharps legend on the frontier was not the Civil War carbine. It was the heavy, big-game hunting models built for the professional buffalo hunters who began working the vast herds of the southern plains in the late 1860s. The model 1874 in particular, chambered in cartridges with names like .50-90, .50-110, and the devastating .45-110 became the tool that wrote the Sharps rifle into the history of the American West. These were not hunting rifles in any comfortable modern sense. The barrel alone on a heavy-barreled Sharps could run to 30 inches in length, and with the steel block action and dense walnut stock, the whole assembly might weigh 12 to 15 pounds. Carrying one across a mile of rough terrain was a commitment. The recoil was real, leaving a callus on the shoulder after sustained use. The powder charges in the big .50 caliber loads burned so much black powder that the smoke cloud from a single shot could temporarily obscure the shooter's view of his target. Professional hunters learned to wait for the smoke to clear before searching for the result. The vernier rear sight was an extraordinary piece of precision engineering for its era. Graduated in fine increments and adjustable for both elevation and windage, it assumed a shooter who understood the ballistics of his cartridge well enough to know how much the bullet dropped at various distances, who could estimate range across broken terrain, and who understood the effect of wind on a heavy bullet traveling for nearly a full second before it arrived at its destination. The southern herd of American bison ranged across Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and the Indian Territory in numbers estimated somewhere between 3 and 4 million animals before the professional hunters arrived in earnest. The hide hunters came for the leather, buffalo hides processed into industrial belting bringing $2 to $3 each at their peak, and they came by the hundreds to the southern plains in the early 1870s. A professional buffalo hunter did not run down the herd. He found them, positioned himself crosswind at a distance, and began shooting from a stand. From 200 yards, from 300, farther when conditions allowed, he could work through a herd methodically, killing animals one at a time, while the others milled in confusion around the fallen. Tom Nixon reportedly killed 120 buffalo from a single stand in just under an hour. Billy Dixon and others described stands of 60, 80, 100 animals without moving their shooting position. What the hunters were developing was something more than buffalo hunting. They were building a discipline of long-range precision shooting that had no equivalent anywhere in the world. Reading wind by observing its effect on distant grass, estimating range across featureless terrain, compensating for bullet drop at distances where the trajectory became a pronounced arc. By the time a hunter had worked the southern plains for 2 or 3 years, he had fired more rounds at difficult targets under varying conditions than most military marksmen would fire in a career. When the fight at Adobe Walls came, these men did not suddenly become marksmen. They already were marksmen. The only difference was that the targets were moving faster and shooting back. By the spring of 1874, the hide hunters had pushed deep into territory. The Comanche and their Kiowa and Southern Cheyenne allies considered the last refuge of the old life. The Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867 was supposed to have kept them out of the Texas Panhandle. They came anyway. Quanah Parker had watched the buffalo disappear from ranges where his people had always hunted. He had watched the hunters kill thousands of animals a day and take only the hides, leaving the carcasses to rot in numbers that made the waste read less like hunting and more like the systematic destruction of an entire way of life. He understood clearly and correctly that the hide hunters were not simply a commercial nuisance. They were the mechanism by which the Plains tribes would be starved into submission. The attack on Adobe Walls came in the hour before dawn on June 27, 1874. A young hunter named Billy Ogg heard approaching horses in time to raise an alarm. Warriors swept through the compound in the dark and fought hand-to-hand at the doorways. Two hunters, the Shadler brothers, were killed in their wagon before they could reach cover. But the hunters reached their rifles, got inside the buildings, and held the doorways against the first charge. What the warriors encountered over the next several days was something they had not fully anticipated. The hunters' Sharps rifles changed the geometry of the fight completely. A warrior who pulled up his horse at 400 yards to assess the situation from what should have been a safe distance was not safe. Men and horses began falling at ranges that simply should not have been lethal, and the psychological effect on warriors who had never encountered precision long-range fire was significant and cumulative. On the third day, a group of warriors assembled on a distant ridge to watch the trading post from what they clearly believed was an impregnable position. Billy Dixon was handed a Sharps .50-90. He looked at the distant riders. He studied the wind. He adjusted his rear sight. He fired. 874 yards. The distance was measured afterward by an Army survey team. One man on the ridge fell. The other riders scattered immediately. The siege was effectively broken. What spread across the plains in the weeks after was not just the story of 29 hunters holding out against 1,000 warriors. What spread was the specific detail: that a man with a Sharps rifle had reached out to a target nearly 500 yards farther than conventional tactical assumption allowed, and the man on that far ridge had come down from his horse, that there was no safe distance, that the open country itself had become dangerous in a new and unprecedented way. To understand why the Sharps was so deeply feared, you have to think carefully about what violence meant to the men who lived with it daily in the West. Close-range violence was understood. It was terrible and final, but it had a certain symmetry. When two men faced each other with revolvers on a dusty street, both of them were in danger, and both of them could act. The outcome was uncertain, but the terms were clear. Speed, nerve, and accuracy determined who walked away. You could shoot him. He could shoot you. The Sharps violated those rules completely. When a man on a distant hillside, a man you could not even see, was capable of sending a bullet into your body at 600 yards, the old rules did not apply. You could not charge him fast enough. You could not outrun a bullet already in the air before you heard the shot. At that range, the bullet traveled faster than sound and arrived before any warning was possible. A man hit at 500 yards heard nothing. His companions heard the distant report a fraction of a second later, looked toward it, and saw nothing but open ground and maybe a faint smear of black powder smoke dissolving in the wind. That was the specific terror of the Sharps. Not merely that it was powerful, not merely that it was accurate beyond what any other field firearm could manage. It was the particular dread of invisible death at a distance so great it seemed beyond the natural order. You had no chance to respond, no time to act, no opportunity to apply any of the survival instincts that a man living a violent life had developed through hard experience. Comanche warriors who had ridden against Spanish lances and American Army cavalry without flinching began to look differently at open ground after Adobe Walls. Officers who wrote about the Red River War campaigns noted a new caution in the way raiding parties approached positions believed to contain long-range shooters. The presence of even a handful of skilled marksmen with Sharps rifles complicated attacks that would otherwise have been pressed with confidence. Men who did not fear close combat began to fear the man they could not see. Rustlers working the open range understood that a rancher with a long-range rifle could make driving stolen cattle across exposed ground a potentially fatal exercise. Outlaws planning ambushes began to account for the possibility that the man they were watching might be watching back through a telescopic sight. The Sharps changed not just individual engagements, but the entire tactical thinking of men who lived by violence in open country. Several men became specifically associated with the Sharps rifle and the long-range shooting culture it produced. Bat Masterson arrived on the Southern Plains in 1871 looking for work and found it as a buffalo hunter. He was present at Adobe Walls and participated in the defense, watching Billy Dixon make his famous shot and understanding, from years of professional hunting, exactly what had been achieved. When he later became a lawman in Dodge City and other Kansas cow towns, he carried the knowledge of what a Sharps could do into a professional life that required managing dangerous men. His reputation rested partly on the understood fact that he had spent years in an occupation that produced some of the most capable marksmen on the continent. Frank Mayer came to the Buffalo Ranges in 1872 and spent more than a decade working the hide trade before eventually writing a memoir that described the craft of professional long-range shooting with precision that reads almost like a training document. Mayer wrote about choosing positions with stable rests and clear sight lines, reading wind by observing grass movement at distance, and building a mental ballistic chart so he knew precisely how much his bullet dropped at 300 yards, at 400, at 500. He was not romanticizing violence. He was describing a skilled profession, and his account makes clear that the extraordinary shots associated with the Sharps were not accidents. They were the product of years of deliberate practice. The Army also had its Sharp specialists. During the Indian campaigns of the 1870s, former buffalo hunters employed as scouts gave column commanders options they had not previously possessed. The specific conditions of plains warfare, open terrain, long sight lines, mobile enemy cavalry made the long-range marksman uniquely valuable in a way that the same skill might not have been in wooded or broken country where engagements happened at shorter ranges regardless of what rifle a man carried. The question that follows Billy Dixon's famous shot through every retelling is the honest one. Could he actually aim precisely at a specific man at 874 yards? Or was it a fortunate combination of skill and chance at the outer edge of what the rifle could do? Dixon himself was ambiguous about the shot in his later years. He described it on at least one occasion as a scratch shot, an old hunting term acknowledging the attempt was at the extreme edge of reasonable expectation, tried with the understanding that precise aim at that range was more aspiration than guaranteed. He was trying to put a bullet among the distant riders. The shot connected. He was too honest a man to claim more than that. This is actually the more impressive version of the story. Not the mythologized account where a master marksman threads a needle at half a mile through pure technical virtuosity, but the real one, where a young man with a powerful rifle and years of field experience made a calculation and attempted a shot that conventional wisdom said was impossible. And he was right about the rifle in a way that nobody on that distant ridge had anticipated. The Sharps .50-90 cartridge was capable of it. A 500-grain bullet retained enough velocity at 800 yards to wound or kill a man, even as it fell through the final stages of its long arc. The shot required ballistic knowledge, a carefully adjusted rear sight, a stable shooting position, and a degree of fortune that Dixon freely acknowledged. What it did not require was any magic. What matters is not the question of aim versus luck. What matters is that it happened. The warriors on the ridge did not know whether Dixon had aimed at one specific man or had simply sent a round in their direction and trusted the rifle's reach. What they knew was that one of their number fell from his horse at a distance they had believed was safe. The conclusion was entirely rational. There was no safe distance from these men. The Sharps did not exist in isolation on the frontier. It competed against a rapidly evolving field of repeating rifles and revolvers, and the tension between these different force groups almost exactly like a different philosophy of what fighting actually is. By the mid-1870s, Winchester rifles had become widely available and widely respected. The model 1873 Winchester offered something the Sharps could never match: the ability to fire 12 or 15 rounds without reloading. In a close-range fight in a canyon or a street or a darkened saloon, 15 rounds of .44-40 in a tubular magazine was substantially more useful than a single round of .50-90 in a breech, regardless of how much more powerful that single round was. The gunfighters and outlaws and lawmen whose names filled the popular history of the West almost universally preferred repeating arms for the work they actually did. Billy the Kid favored a Winchester. Jesse James relied on Colt revolvers and a Winchester carbine. The fast, chaotic violence of the cowtowns and outlaw trails happened at ranges where the Sharps' extreme range advantage was irrelevant and its single-shot limitation was a potentially fatal weakness. Nobody was shooting at a man across 800 yards of Tombstone's main street. But the men who worked open country understood the equation differently. A buffalo hunter on featureless terrain, a scout riding ahead of a column, a rancher watching a distant tree line. These men had situations where a rifle capable of reaching out to 500 or 600 yards with genuine accuracy was worth more than all the Winchester magazines in Kansas. The Sharps gave them a tool for a specific problem that nothing else solved as well. The two rifle cultures existed in parallel and were not hostile to each other. Men who understood what the Sharps could do respected it even when they did not carry one. And men who carried Sharps rifles kept a revolver and a Winchester nearby for the occasions like those. The thing that made the Sharps necessary was also the thing that destroyed the convention's first use. The southern herd of American bison, numbered in the millions in the late 1860s was, by the early 1880s, effectively gone. Where the ground had once shaken under the passage of tens of thousands of bison, there was now bleached bone stretching to the horizon. So many skeletons that collectors came out to harvest them for fertilizer, and the bone trade briefly became its own industry, a final extraction from the wreckage of what had been one of the greatest concentrations of wildlife the planet had produced. The military campaigns following the Red River War concluded with the confinement of the remaining free bands to reservation land. The specific environment that had produced the Sharps shooting culture, the open plains, the enormous herds, the need to reach targets at distances that made conventional rifles inadequate, ceased to exist. The Sharps Rifle Manufacturing Company closed its doors in 1881. The men who had carried these rifles professionally had no more professional use for them. Some became lawmen, some became Army Scouts. Some disappeared into the general population of the West, carrying their Sharps rifles in their wagon beds and their particular knowledge of long-range shooting in their heads. The fear of the long-range marksman did not end with the closing of the Sharps factory. It traveled forward, carried in the institutional memory of the military and the cultural memory of the West, and it shaped things that came long after. The Civil War sharpshooter tradition that the Sharps had supported fed directly into the development of military sniper doctrine through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The specific skills that made a buffalo hunter effective at 600 yards, wind reading, range estimation, ballistic knowledge, trigger control, patience, were the same skills military theorists began identifying and formalizing as precision marksmanship entered the mainstream of military thinking. The Sharps had proved, on the Great Plains, that a single skilled marksman could change the outcome of engagements, break sieges, and make an entire force cautious and reactive rather than aggressive and mobile. The cowboys and warriors and soldiers who feared the man with the Sharps were right to fear him. Not because every long shot hit its target, not because the mythologies that grew up around the gun were literally true in every detail. They were right because the Sharps rifle represented a genuine expansion of what was possible in armed conflict. It extended the killing zone past the point where any existing tactical thinking had prepared men to operate. It created a category of vulnerability that had not existed before, a range at which a man in the open could die without warning, without recourse, without any option except the slim hope that the man on the far hillside was not as skilled as the stories claimed. On the frontier, where violence was a practical reality that men thought about in practical terms, that kind of fear was entirely rational. The Sharps was not the fastest gun. It was not the gun you wanted if the fight came close. It was not the gun for the saloon or the street or the narrow canyon ambush. It was the gun that made you afraid of the horizon. And on the open plains of the American West, where the horizon was always visible and always near and always potentially dangerous, that was the most powerful thing any weapon could be.